if I can get what we talked about, which is $3,000 back into the hands of every worker in this country, and I can make sure that wealthy Americans continue to pay all the way up and I make Social Security solvent, that would be a success.
What if the real political divide in America isn't left versus right, but people who can still make ends meet versus people who can't? I'm your host, Greg Amrofell, and today on Pacific Time, Ashley Brown and I are joined by Brandon Riker, a California congressional candidate who argues that affordability isn't a slogan or a buzzword. It alludes to many different and all too real challenges for so many of us that add up to the defining crisis of our time. Brandon has worked in business, organized on the ground, and now he's running for Congress in a newly redrawn district born of California's Prop 50 vote. His district stretches from the Coachella Valley to San Diego County. We talk about why Americans keep ping-ponging between parties, why Democrats lose when they talk past working people, and what it would actually mean to put cash back in workers' pockets. This is a conversation about economics, democracy, and what governing could look like if we stopped dodging the hard stuff and stopped confusing snarky memes for real political action. Brandon's the first active candidate for office to come on Pacific Time, the first of many, we hope. We're interested in talking with the people who are stepping up for civic duty in these challenging times so we can learn about how they're planning to represent the West Coast. Ashley's in the driver's seat for this conversation, and he dove in on a hot topic. We recorded our interview just a few days after Renee Good's apparent murder by an ICE agent in Minneapolis and asked Brandon for his view on the implications.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. First is that we've got to rein in ICE's budget, right? One of the things that people have talked about, but probably not enough in the big ugly bill, was that ICE's budget just exploded. And that's something we've got to rein in. But for example, here in California, Governor Newsom said, if you're law enforcement, you can't wear a mask. We can't have federal agents in our streets being masked without warrants going around. No one's really sure who they are. No one's really sure if they're actually even federal agents. Right. It's just creating undue anxiety. And we're seeing really horrific consequences because of those actions. So we've got to make sure that people are masked. And the third piece is we don't need federal law enforcement armed in our cities to do as effectively states' jobs. Like we can help deal with immigration. We can help deal with crime. We don't need, especially when governors and mayors and legislators are saying, please do not send them to our cities. It's only going to increase the pressure. We don't need that. We've got to rein it in.
In the lead up to this interview, Greg and I were exchanging texts sort of all week, very frustrated about, this ICE situation. And we've been pretty surprised at how tepid I feel like the response of elected officials has actually been to the fact that ICE agents are shooting people on the street. Is there anything that you wish elected officials, whether it be Senator Schumer or even Senator Klobuchar and Senator Smith in Minnesota, would say in this moment?
So I think this is a bigger, and I don't want to minimize what happened in Minneapolis at all, but this has been a problem for elected Democrats since this administration came into power, which is that they're not in their districts actually joining the protests on the street. Some are, there's no doubt, right? But what we're seeing is these kind of statements coming out of Washington. People are saying, oh, we're going to, try to get into the Department of Education in the beginning of this administration for really unclear reasons. Like even if you got in, talk to Linda McMahon, like that's not going to do anything. What I believe and what we've been doing is I believe that elected members and people running need to be in their district, both getting local press attention, but also talking to constituents about what these actions mean and how we actually organize, not just say we're going to go knock on doors, but really build grassroots campaigns so that we win the next election. But more importantly, we can pass legislation to rein this in, whether it's on the Department of Education, whether it's on ICE agents. It can't just be statements in social media anymore. It's got to be on the ground boots, members and candidates showing up at No King's protests, speaking at, courageous resistance events and being like, this is how we do it. We're going to be with the people, not standing back.
Brandon, can I ask, as a member, would you support governors or mayors who investigated and prosecuted ICE members for breaking state law?
I mean, 100%. I don't think you can have the FBI shutting down the investigation here and then saying, a state crime potentially was committed, right? I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but when you look at it, someone got shot. We don't know exactly. I mean, we need an investigation, right? And it needs to be transparent and full. But when the FBI just says, well, it's a federal agent, we're shutting down the investigation, the state needs to step up and do an investigation. Just like, here in California, where we've had police officers draw down on ICE agents because they're not sure they're actually ICE agents, right? Like we can't have this anymore. And mayors, or really county prosecutors, city prosecutors, attorneys general, they need to start stepping up and saying, if a state crime is committed, we're going to prosecute.
What in your personal experience led you to transition from the private sector and a business owner into throwing your hat in the ring to run for Congress?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. One is my entire career has always been this mix of business and politics. I got my start in politics because I opposed the Iraq War. And so at 16, I started knocking on doors for Wesley Clark's presidential campaign. And then that led to an internship for John Kerry, which eventually led to me being the youngest staffer on the 07-08 Obama campaign at 19, leaving college in my sophomore year to go work on that race. So it's not like I'm a newbie to the political sphere. But what really made me start thinking about running was about 2 weeks before the general election, this last 2024 general election. I was in Nevada knocking doors for Vice President Harris. And I went to this door, GOTV door, get out the vote door, of a Democrat, and her thesis, she had a kid. Should be an easy vote, should just tell them where their voting precinct is and move on. And the conversation went, I'm paraphrasing here, but it said, hi, my name's Brandon, I'm volunteer with the Harris Walls campaign. Can the vice president count on your vote? And she said, no. I said, okay, we got to talk about this. And more or less what she said was that what the Democrats are talking about is hypothetical money. A first-time homeowner's tax credit. She's like, I can't afford my rent. So there's no way I'm going to be able to buy a home. So that's money I'll never see. First year childhood tax credit. She's like, I already have a kid. He's 3 years old. I'm not going to have another. It's money I'm never going to see. And she said, Donald Trump said no tax on tips. And in the moment, I don't know whether she believed Trump would actually achieve that. But what became clear to me was that the Democratic Party had missed her and did not recognize the pain she was suffering in the economy. She was working multiple jobs. She wasn't able to make ends meet. And we were saying the economy is great because the unemployment rate's low and the stock market's high. And I realized that that's kind of when I knew we were in trouble in this election. I didn't think we'd be in as big trouble as we were, but I realized we were going to have a problem. And when I decided to run officially, it's because I'm a trained economist. There isn't a single trained economist in the House of Representatives, 435 members, not one. And it's like, if we're going to actually start solving economic issues, we might want to send someone who's actually studied tariffs, who's actually studied like how the tax code works and what we need to do to actually reduce income inequality instead of just talking about it, right? And so that's why I got in this race, because if we don't solve the economy, all the other issues, LGBT rights, which I did, care deeply about, a woman's right to choose, which I care deeply about, actually solving climate change, which is an existential threat to the planet, making sure that our democracy is healthy. We can't solve any of that if we can't win elections, and we can't win elections unless we have an answer on the economy.
So you touched on two interesting things there. One was we were proposing, or Democrats were proposing a bunch of things that weren't going to help this woman's life. But then also you touched on something that I think Donald Trump does extremely well, which is boil really complex things down into sound bites that people intuitively understand really well. So do you think that the Democrats' challenge is a policy problem? They're just coming out with policies that actually don't help people as much as they think they do? Or is it a messaging problem? Or is it potentially both?
It's both. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. Can Build Back Better, right? Huge policy, put a lot of political capital on it. Really hard to explain to people how it's going to make their life better, other than sort of the abstract of, well, we're going to create infrastructure jobs, or we're going to have better roads, right? But at the end of the day, unless you work in construction, you're like, how is that going to help me, right? How does that affect my life? And we should do it, and we need better infrastructure in this country. But I mean, that's a really hard thing to message when people are working 3 jobs, right? That somehow this road we're going to build down the street from you is going to make your life better, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Greg and I both live in Seattle, and there's a lot of work being done on I-5, which goes right through Seattle, and a lot of that work was funded as part of the infrastructure bill. And there's a giant sign that says this work funded by the bipartisan infrastructure reinvestment act or something to that effect. And I was just thinking the other day as I drove past it, it's now very weathered and very old. But as I was driving past it, I was like thinking to myself, if that had been a Donald Trump project, it would have had his name on it.
Right. It would have been the Donald Trump build this road plan. I tell this story and when I worked in Montana in 2008, Max Baucus was I believe he was on appropriations, and there were always signs next to every, he's up for re-election. Anytime there was a big project being delivered, right, there was a Max Baucus yard sign right next to it to kind of tie the two together, right? And that's the piece. So part of it is messaging, but part of it too is policy as well, right? Like Donald Trump, to your point, Ashley, I think it was yesterday or the day before, came out and said, we want to ban corporate purchases of residential homes, right? That's a very complex issue of how we would actually ban, how you track that, how people put else, like how that would actually function. But I hear that all the time from people when I'm out campaigning that they just can't afford a home. So Donald Trump took an incredibly complex issue, just said, we're just going to do it. And, is getting traction on that. And I think, there is a piece of both policy. We're not doing the right things, but also how we message it.
Obviously, the big thing that scrambled your race and every race in California this year was Prop 50. I would love to know your thoughts on Prop 50, how it affected your race. And then also, it required setting aside what I would argue is a very positive thing, which is independent redistricting and the end of gerrymandering.
The nice part is we did set it aside, but only temporarily, right? So in the prop, it comes back for the 2032 redistricting. So it is only a suspension of what I think is really important, which is citizen-led, nonpartisan redistricting. And that needs to become a model nationwide. And if I get to Congress, when I get to Congress, right, and hopefully we have a Democratic majority in both chambers and Democratic president in 2028, we need to actually sign into law anti-gerrymandering legislation around this country. It just has to happen, because otherwise we're going to continue to see this occur time and time again. I mean, here we are in the middle. There hasn't been a census done, and states are redistricting. This is absolutely crazy, right? And it needs to end. But we had to respond to Texas. You can't just let Texas take 5 seats to go Republican. We are in a fight for the soul of the democracy, of this, really the soul of our country, and we had to step up and do it. So I was proud to vote for Prop 50. It's something I wish I didn't have to do, and I wouldn't have done it unless other Republican states had started it. But we had to do it, and I'm proud that California passed it and responded and is willing to stand up to this administration. In terms of what it did to my race, it made it pretty fascinating. We were originally in a seat that was competitive, but it was a lean Republican, one that, Ken Calvert has held on to for a long time. We were building an incredible campaign to defeat him on the ground along with the money. But now we're in a seat where we get to run against someone else who voted to take away healthcare, who also, is a Trump rubber stamp, and Darrell Issa. And Darrell Issa is a guy who has not had a competitive race in a very long time. And now all of a sudden he's facing such a competitive race that he considered moving to Texas so he could stay in Congress. He's now decided to stay in California. But the issues really don't change. This is now a Democratic +3, but affordability remains the number one issue. And one of my fears is that Democrats are starting to use affordability like a buzzword. Well, we'll just solve affordability. Affordability means different things to different people. So in this district, in some parts like the Coachella Valley, where we have a number of retirees, it's Social Security's COLA going to go up enough to cover more than just, Part B, right? Is it going to actually cover food? Is it going to cover my increase in rent? Or is it going to actually deal with what I need to deal with? In places like Idlewild and the kind of the 215-15 corridor that we have here, it's, can I stay in my home? Because now fire insurance has become so expensive. People may have already bought their home, potentially have paid off their mortgage, and are now concerned, can I actually stay in the house? In some places in San Diego County, which is now part of the district, Escondido, San Marcos, and Vista, it's people who are moving out of the city of San Diego because the rents are too high, but now they're seeing their rents go up. And they're like, can I even rent a home? Forget about buying a house. Am I going to be able to even get in shelter? And then across the entire district, it's because this is a very suburban district. It's what are the jobs that I can get that pay more than $17, $18 an hour that don't require me to drive 2 or 3 hours to get that job? So when we say affordability, it's important to localize it. It's important to understand what that means. And it's important to actually have solutions that can work across the district because it's not a one-size-fits-all problem.
It's a big year for the West Coast, a pivotal year for the country, and we're going new places with Pacific Time. These challenging times call for togetherness and collective action. That's why co-hosts and collaborators like Ashley Brown will be with us often. And because these divisive times call for cooler heads, we're going to shift away from hot takes that help no one. Our hope is to get more hopeful, more constructive, more substantive, and not shy away from emotion when the times call for that too. What if this year we mention Trump less and look beyond his administration's obvious crimes against democracy? What if we focus on what we on the West Coast can get done when we look past the DC dons? What if there are reasons to believe that we can make life here even better? Continue listening on your favorite podcast platforms. More video is coming your way on YouTube, and words are starting to flow on Substack. All of this can be found at Pacific Time Podcast. If you like what we're up to on Pacific Time, we have a favor to ask. Will you write a review of the show and share it with your friends? This stuff really helps us get the word out. Now, back to the conversation with California congressional candidate Brandon Riker. So, Brandon, the 40th district, as it's been redrawn through Prop 50, is now, as you're hinting, an incredibly diverse district that crosses the urban and rural divides. What's your strategy for representing such a district, particularly if you can't take action on all three of those approaches to affordability that you just outlined?
Yeah, so it's actually mostly a suburban district. So it does have it does have a strong working class tie throughout most of the district. So it's not quite as economically diverse or it's very suburban, very economically tied together. That being said, it's a big district. It now stretches from the Coachella Valley all the way down nearly to the Mexican border through Riverside County and into San Diego County. So there's a couple things. One is anyone who's going to represent this district has to get to every part of it. So in our campaign already, we've done now 92 listening tour sessions, 4 town halls as well. Because if I'm going to represent this district, I have to understand the issues that voters actually want to talk about. And as important as it is to go to Democratic club meetings and talk with Democratic activists often don't have the same view or have the same priorities as independent voters or voters who maybe don't have time to go to a meeting. So we vary the times of our listening tours. We vary our town halls to make sure that we can meet with as many people as possible and really understand the district. The second piece of that, to the point of how you represent this district, and this gets back to what we talked about earlier in my view on how we actually need to solve the economy. We need a second New Deal in this country that stops trying to say we're going to solve, student debt or apprenticeships. We need to stop trying to solve the rent crisis or the fact that people are getting kicked out of their homes because of insurance. We need to solve it all. And the only way we do that is if we get a tax code that actually starts bringing revenue into this government and starts allowing us to invest in social programs again. That's the way we solve it in order to have the balance sheet we need to really make change in this country.
I think you've hinted at this, but what does representation mean to you in a district as diverse as yours? Not just in campaigning for the district, but representing it when you or someone else goes to Congress.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say it's the same way we do campaign, which is being public and being out there. Darrell Issa, and back to Ashley's question about the difference in the districts, Ken Calvert, neither one has done a town hall in over a decade. Like, that's crazy. They haven't taken, actual questions from their constituents in more than 10 years. That's not a way you represent a district. You represent a district by being accountable to the voters who sent you, but also showing up at things like protests, right? Making sure that you're out there saying, even if we can't pass the legislation now, I hear you. I'm going to stand with you and make sure we're going to keep fighting for this. It means going door to door in an election year, but also making sure that in non-election years, I'm out meeting with nonprofits. I'm out at the food banks. I'm out, with churches. I'm out there having these conversations about what is going on in the community. So when a bill comes, I can either sponsor the right bill, vote for a bill, or, get legislation written to actually solve issues instead of just saying, hey, I'm running on a national platform.
And let me circle back on your point about change to the tax code. The question that's come up for me is, who's a more responsible steward of tax dollars? Is it Washington, D.C., or is it Sacramento?
Well, I think in the case of, well, we're running deficits in both, so let's maybe be careful about who's the best steward of dollars across the board. But I think there's a couple things, right? Like, we are still the United States, and I think, I'm someone who was born in California but grew up in Arizona and Vermont, went to college in Maryland, worked in 8 states for the Obama campaign, moved back to California. I fundamentally believe that we need to have a strong union where all the states and territories are actually thriving. And so what that means is that the tax dollars going to Washington, D.C. need to actually be spent to raise the floor, right? Whether that's in education, whether that's in minimum wage, whether that's making sure Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security is solvent, right? And we're expanding it. That needs to be done at the federal level. Certainly the states, and I can tell you, look, California, we're the largest donor state in the country, right? We get it. We're spending a lot of dollars. I can tell you it was really frustrating when the fires happened in Los Angeles to see Republican politicians stand up and say, we're not going to send dollars to California when we really needed the help, right? And so I get the push to want to have Sacramento take more control. But at the end of the day, what we need is a federal government that looks out for all 50 states and all the territories. And let's also be real. We need to get real representation in the territories and in DC as well. Like, the District of Columbia, I think, is the largest per capita payer of federal tax dollars, yet no representation. You now have Puerto Rico, where we're seeing what's going on in Venezuela, right? The airspace being closed and no actual voting representation out of Puerto Rico, right? It's time that the territories and the District of Columbia have real representation.
Can I actually push you a little bit on that? Because any listener to this podcast knows that electoral reform is something that's very near and dear to my heart. Thomas Jefferson envisioned the government being completely changed every 19 years, which was generational in 1789. We haven't really done anything. That the size of the House has been frozen since the 20s at 435 members. Back in the 20s, when we froze the size of the House, the average member of Congress represented something like 115,000 people. Now it's 800,000 people. The Senate, of course, is 2 senators per state, no matter how big, how much they contribute. So double-barreled question. Should we, in your view, look at potentially increasing the size of the House of Representatives to better match the size and the scale of population? That would also, incidentally, help correct the imbalance in the Electoral College, because states like California and Texas, I might add, and Florida would get dozens of extra electoral vote seats. And the second part of that question is, should we potentially consider reforming the Senate to be more representative of the population in the country as a whole?
So the first part is a little bit easier because it can be done with just legislational change, right? The House can be expanded without a constitutional amendment. So yes, I'm sure someone has a much better idea of exactly how many members in the House should be. My argument has been, I think Wyoming is the smallest House seat. That should just be the size of every congressional district. And then we figure out the math from there. Because it is pretty crazy if you think about it. When I'm elected, I will have almost 2.5 times the number of constituents as the representative from Wyoming has, right? And I'm just as one out of 50 some in California. So that's certainly something we have to look at. So I actually fully support expanding the House. We need to do it. We should keep doing it. I can't believe we've stopped. The Supreme Court's the other one. I think we froze at 9 in the 1860s, like right after the Civil War, I think is when we kind of froze the Supreme Court. We need to expand the Supreme Court. Once again, doesn't require a constitutional amendment. The Senate reform obviously would, right? Because that's one where now we get into a constitutional amendment. We used to pass constitutional amendments fairly regularly in this country. We've now stopped. Politics is kind of the art of the practical and also dreaming about bigger things. I don't know how we could get a constitutional amendment through to change the Senate, right? I wish we could. And if there's a path, I'm all for it. But the one thing we can do immediately is expand the court and expand the House, and we have to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. You landed on where most political scientists actually think we should start, which is whatever is the smallest state population. Yeah. Because every state, of course, must have at least one representative. That should be the size of every district. By the way, that would lead to the House getting about 140 new members. And people think, oh, that's crazy, 570 members of Congress. Well, the German Bundestag has about 600. The British Parliament has 650. So it's actually not that uncommon
Well,
to have a chamber that big.
and also, if we kind of kicked this off with Prop 50, and there's two pieces of gerrymandering that are the problem. One is that seats are gerrymandered. So this would help eliminate gerrymandering if you had more local representation. The second piece is the money in politics, right? Is that because there's so few actual competitive House seats in this nation, all the money flows to those. And so it is crazy to think that in a House of Representatives seat, you would have to spend 20 or $30 million to flip it. That's insane. If you have more seats, they're more competitive, they're less gerrymandered, that money has to be spread out, right? Because End Citizens United, I've taken the pledge to End Citizens United. I'm not taking any corporate PAC money. I think we have to overturn it. But once again, that's a constitutional issue. That's not a legislative issue, right? So how do we solve it legislatively? Let's expand the House.
Yeah. Well, since we're on the topic of money, you are an economist. I would love to know, what are 2 or 3 just very concrete policy proposals that you would advocate that would ease the cost of living challenges for Californians and all Americans?
So the one that I talk about a lot, because all of us who have a W-2 see this, is FICA tax, right? Social Security tax. So every American who gets a W-2 pays 6% on the first 184,000. And if you make more than 184,000, you stop paying the tax. I've got 2 thoughts on that. One is, let's eliminate the income cap. So if you make 500,000 or $1 million, you pay 6% all the way up. But let's also make the first 50,000 tax-free. That's $3,000 back to every American in their paycheck if they make 50,000 or more, right? And in paychecks, not at tax time, not a tax refund, not something you have to wait for. That's cash back in your pocket every month. So that's one thing I think we could do immediately, and we should do, both to make Social Security solvent, but also to put money back in the hands of working people in this country. The second is we need to get student debt relief, but we also have to pair it with investment in apprenticeship programs, right? Those two things have to go together. And so whether it's a term of service for debt relief in this country, if you volunteer, 6 years or 5 years, we can debate that. That has to be debated. It has to be legislated. Whether it's in a school or it's a Peace Corps, right? That you would get debt relief, but we also have to make sure we're taking care of people who choose not to go to college, so that way we have a path so that people can get home ownership. They can build wealth in this country, no matter what they decide to choose after high school.
One of our prior guests, Nicole Trimble, was an early part of AmeriCorps and now focuses all her time on workforce development up and down the West Coast. And I think the connection between those two is really interesting to explore. She highlights that, volunteering at an early age is actually great training, not to mention the fact that it builds patriotism and that it fuels kind of workforce creation and retraining as well.
Well, and it's huge. And I think, here in California, we have some pilot programs going in. There are pieces about for students who are going to the state college system, right? That they can get their tuition, even if they're on scholarships, they can get more of the tuition deferred or taken away, the cost, because they volunteer over the summers. It's a really good program. And to your point, Greg, it gets you to meet people from different backgrounds. It gets you to meet people from different geographies. People have different ideas, different upbringings. And that's back to Ashley's point earlier about the nation. That's what really makes this country amazing, right? Is that we're geographically incredibly diverse. We're ethnically incredibly diverse, but we tend to silo ourselves. And we need to start breaking those silos down, and volunteering is a great way to do it.
Hey, a follow-up on Ashley's question about measures you would take around economic relief.
Yeah.
Is there anything about your constituents in California that is distinct and different compared to Americans elsewhere in the country?
Well, I think there's a couple things. So the two first ones I'll lead with. One is that this is not unique to California, but it's quasi-unique. Fire insurance in the state, right? So obviously a lot of southern states, a lot of Sunbelt states are dealing with hurricane insurance, right? Flood insurance. There's more national programs for that. Fire insurance is becoming a bigger and bigger problem as we fail to solve climate change or deal with climate change. And so now what has happened in California is actually next month in February, the moratorium on being dropped goes away. And so it's going to be a question of, okay, how am I going to get fire insurance? And if so, how much is it going to cost? We have a great state plan that was put together, in the 1980s, 1970s. It was never designed, though, to take 40 million people, right? That was just never its intent. And I do think we need national catastrophic insurance for homes. combining flood, fire, tornado, earthquake, right? So we can expand the pool to make sure that people actually don't lose their home because they get priced out by private insurance. So it's not necessarily unique to California, but it's becoming a unique problem among fire insurance here. Although I assume it's probably an issue in Washington State as
It
well,
is.
in the areas around, where people are in their force. The second one is the minimum wage, right? The federal minimum wage sitting at $7.25 an hour, not really going up, is a huge problem because in California, we're sitting at $7.25 or $7.50 an hour. It's $17.50 an hour. It sounds better. It's still nowhere near enough to live in California, right? And so we need to make sure that the federal minimum wage is going up so that California continues to be pushed upward. And so that has to happen. And that's something we need to do nationally. But those are the two big ones. I think the housing crisis here in California is not unique. It feels unique to California because we see it all the time. But I think that's a pretty common problem in states that are expanding, right? In areas where the economy is pretty strong, is that housing costs just continue to skyrocket.
Can I take you back to the fire and catastrophic insurance? Because I think that's actually a really interesting idea. We happen to be recording this around the first anniversary of the Altadena fires in LA. And the journalist Jacob Soboroff had a really interesting sort of analysis of that fire, in that it was the fire of the future.
Yeah.
We are increasingly going to see, with climate change, fires that level entire neighborhoods or sections of densely inhabited places. These are not just trees that are burning. It's going to be whole neighborhoods. So this notion of fire being treated just like hurricanes or floods, why hasn't that happened already? And do you think that there could be broad bipartisan support to create a national catastrophic insurance program?
Yeah, I honestly don't know why it hasn't been done. I mean, fire insurance is obviously, it's not new, but to your point, Ashley, it's becoming more chronic, right? More acute, like we see it year after year. And I'll just give you a story. I have a constituent or a voter a supporter of mine up in Idlewild, whose fire insurance in the last 5 years has gone from $1,000 to $2,000 to $4,000 to $8,000. So if you think about, she's in her 70s, you think about $8,000 a year, I can tell you Social Security has not grown 8 times, right? So the amount of money she's spending on fire insurance just continues to grow and grow as a percentage of her income, and that's becoming a real problem. So I think it hasn't been as much as a problem as it has been now, and it really became a problem even before the fires last year. I got dropped from fire insurance November of last year, along with a lot of Californians, unexpectedly. I went back, my price tripled. And so this is becoming a thing that is now just becoming a serious problem here in the state. Unfortunately, both Representative Issa and Representative Calvert, who represented this area, well, Calvert now and Issa, after Prop 50 in the next election, neither one has dealt with it. And neither one has proposed anything to actually solve this issue. And I think there will be bipartisan support for it if we can tie it with flood and hurricane and earthquake and tornado and say, look, this is a national problem. Whether you live in Florida, whether you live in New England, whether you live in the West, this is becoming a problem, and we need to solve it.
How would you go about balancing business growth with worker protections in your district?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I think that's a real national issue with how we balance those two. So I mean, there are like some real tangible things we can do that are pretty quick. Right, we need to pass the PRO Act to make sure people can unionize, and that has to get done. That probably won't get signed into law under President Trump, so that's a 2028 issue, right? 2029 issue. Raising the minimum wage is certainly one of them, but part of it is when we think about the way that the tax code is written right now, right? We're really heavy on income tax. The issue and the inequality is that for a large percentage of billionaires and people who have over 100 million, they're not making it through income, right? They're making it through capital gains taxes. And we don't really have a progressive long-term capital gains tax in this country, and we need to have one, right? So that if you built your business on the back of workers and then you sell it, you're not paying 15% capital gains or 20% capital gains. You're paying, 50, 60% capital gains tax, because that's really where the money's generated. And then also making sure we do things like closing the loophole for margin loans. It's something that people don't really talk about, but it's there, right? Ways people shelter their capital gains taxes to avoid paying it. We need to close the loophole. And then we also have we can't probably ban stock buybacks, but we need to put a tax on it to make it cost prohibitive for companies just to buy their stock back, right? They either need to be investing in workers or R&D or returning that money to shareholders so it can be reinvested. It shouldn't just go to artificially increase the price of the stock.
For our listeners who are not economists, can you quickly explain what margin loans and stock
Yeah.
buyback are?
So a margin loan. So let's take someone who may own a car company and a space company, and let's just hypothetically say he got $500 billion in his stock portfolio, right? So what he could do if he needed cash is he could sell some of that, pay a capital gains tax, and then go spend it. What he's doing now is he's saying, okay, I don't want to sell anything, so he needs, let's say, $100 million. He borrows $100 million against his portfolio, gets charged a pretty minimal interest rate because he's got the money to back it up, has that cash, didn't have to sell anything, doesn't pay taxes on it, and he's got the liquidity. That's what we have to close, right? So that's a margin loan. The stock buyback is when a company has profits because they haven't been paying, their fair share of taxes, or they haven't been investing in their workforce, and they say, well, what are we going to do with this money? It's just sitting around. And instead of putting it to productive use, they just buy back their own shares, right? And what it does is it raises the stock price. Oftentimes CEO pays based on the price of the stock, but it's actually not putting any money back into the economy. So the workers who are building that wealth aren't seeing the returns.
One of the largest sectors doing stock buybacks throughout the early 2010s were airlines. They went on a stock buyback spree for many, many, many years. Then COVID comes along and they all get bailed out. Do you think that we should if you do excessive stock buybacks, make you ineligible for taxpayer bailouts?
I think the easier way to do that is to actually put a penalty on doing stock buybacks going forward. Because obviously we want to have a robust air, we want certain things in national security to continue to flow, right? We want air travel to continue, right? So we don't want that to happen. What we do want to say is that this is just something that if you want to do it, fine, but you're going to pay a penalty, right? And we just disincentivize it going forward. That's the way that I would handle that. There was one piece I want to bring up and why I think things like margin loans and capital gains tax matter. And it's something I talk a lot about on the campaign trail to try to help people realize this. In 1968, the minimum wage was $1.75 an hour. The S&P closed at about 103 that year. The S&P now, I don't know the exact math where it's sitting at the moment, but it's 6,600 and something. If you were to tie minimum wage to that capital labor ratio to the same, minimum wage would be over $80 an hour today, right? And so when people say, well, it's at $7.25, we should take it to 20. The point is we don't need an $82 an hour minimum wage. What we need is to actually tax how the wealth is being generated in this country, and it's not on wages, right? It's coming through the equity markets, and that's where we need to focus our taxation to get revenue.
So let me clarify. There's been talk about billionaire taxes. Are you an advocate of that, or are you saying that there are more effective surgical approaches to kind of tapping the same people?
I'm not necessarily inherently opposed to a billionaire tax. The problem is it's like a one-off tax that's being proposed here in California. And it's also really hard to tax illiquid assets, right? Things that people haven't sold. What I believe in is we need to be better at taxing at the point of transfer. So when wealth is really moving into someone's pocket, especially billionaires and centimillionaires, that's where we need to tax. And that's what's coming through in margin loans. That's what's coming through in capital gains taxes, right? That's how they're getting there. I'm not sure that a billionaire tax, although I know it's widely popular, I understand why, but I don't think it's a sustainable way to actually get the revenue we need at the federal level to fund programs. What we need is something that's continuous and predictable as a tax. And we know that people are going to spend money. People are going to make businesses in this country. That's the taxation point we need.
And what I hear you advocating is a shift from regressive taxes, where as on a percentage basis, poorer people are paying an undue share, to a progressive one where wealthier people are paying more than their share.
Or at least their share. I don't know if they have to pay more than their share. They have to pay their share. I mean, the thing about Social Security, like $184,000 is a lot of money, but everyone is paying up to 6% of that. If you're making $500,000, you're basically making almost twice that at no tax for Social Security. You're not paying into the system. And the thing is that, I'm an entrepreneur. I build businesses. You don't build this alone. You build it because we have a great school system. You build it because we actually have markets that function. You build it because we have infrastructure, that is aged and we need to improve, but still functions, right? You don't build it alone. People, especially entrepreneurs, I think understand that this is a unique country that we're able to do that. And we should give back to make sure that this country can continue to do that.
Why does that cap exist? What is the argument for capping it? I mean, it seems to me that that is almost an original sin, that it ensured that lower income people pay for Social Security at a level that wealthier people don't. So why do we have it?
I got to be honest with you. I don't know the history of why we have it. We shouldn't have it, and it should have been gone a long time ago. And this, and look, I'm a Democrat. I've worked for Democrats, but this is part of the problem in the Democratic Party is we don't solve issues like this when we're in power. Like we've had the trifecta. We had the trifecta under Biden. We didn't solve this. We had the trifecta under Obama. We didn't solve this. We didn't codify Roe into law. Like there are things we have to do when we have power that the Democratic Party, for whatever reason, just doesn't do, right? I mean, Ash, to your point about expanding the House, we've been talking, people have been talking about that for a while, right? Making DC a state. That's not something new. And yet we saw what happened on January 6th, where the only person who could call in the DC National Guard was the president, who was, cheering for the insurrection happening on the Capitol. And yet when we took power, we didn't give DC the ability to do anything. I mean, it's crazy. And at some point, the Democratic Party has to actually start solving problems if we want to be the party that leads this country.
But while we're on the subject of tax and a struggle in messaging for the Democratic Party, the party's been labeled as the tax and spend party. And I kind of get why that works. Like tax always feels complicated. It always feels like something's being taken out of your pocket. Is there an opportunity, and just workshop this with me, is there an opportunity to start thinking more about investment opportunities in public goods? Meaning, what if wealthy people were obliged to be investors in massively bigger municipal bonds that can inform infrastructure and schools and better healthcare, and that they, for their trouble, they get financial return, but they have to really put up the cash in order to make that happen?
So I come back to, as an economist, I believe fundamentally that we should incentivize and disincentivize certain behaviors, right? So I'm never a big supporter of banning something or forcing someone to do something, but to your point, make things more attractive or make things less attractive, right? And so I think the original question on should we force people to invest in municipals? No, but what we should do is actually have a tax system where we, maybe can actually just pay for it, right? Like that would be my response to that question. Let's actually get a tax code that is fair, where people are paying their fair share. We're taxing wealth how it's actually generated, not something that is, holdover. I mean, income tax put in, for centuries now, we haven't updated it to income capital gains taxes, right? The way people actually are creating serious wealth in this country. It's time to update the tax code is where I would leave you on that.
I'm going to shift gears a bit. You mentioned it a bit in the context of affordability, but healthcare costs are an out of control expenditure for the country, and sadly are not correlated with improving outcomes. In fact, outcomes are in many ways getting worse, and the costs are growing. What are your ideas for diving into that?
So I'm a big believer in that we need to get a public option like we tried to when we originally were trying to get the ACA through, right? That we really need a public option that people can go into. But right now, mission one is getting the ACA tax credits extended, right? Because there's too many people are going to lose their healthcare in the next little bit here, or they're going to be facing a 300%, 200% increase, and they're not going to be able to afford it, right? And we cannot go back to having 47 million people in this country not have healthcare or have 911 as their healthcare. That has to stop. The other piece is we have to invest in both the federally qualified health clinics, but also in rural hospitals. And so even though I don't have any of the rural hospitals in the district, what I do have is a county next door in Imperial County that has two hospitals, El Centro and Pioneer, that both potentially could close because of the Medicaid cuts. Here's the thing. If you have a heart attack in Imperial County, then you're most likely going to go to JFK in India. JFK has, I think, 11 or 13 emergency room beds. So if they're full, now it's going to Rancho Mirage. And it just becomes a domino system unless people can actually get care where they live. And so we've got to be investing in hospitals that maybe, can't turn a profit or are struggling to turn a profit, because we need people to not be dying of heart attacks and curable diseases, right? So that's one step. Back to the ACA tax credits, expanding them, making sure people go see a doctor. Right now, people are taking premiums that are lower, but with really high deductibles, and then they're not going to go see a doctor. We need to make sure that every American is able to see a doctor, making sure they're getting their yearly physicals. If they have a pre-existing condition like diabetes, high blood pressure, that they're getting that care so they don't end up in an emergency room. That's better for everyone. And the way we do that is to expand the tax credits. When it comes to the overhauling of a healthcare system, right? Like whether we can actually overhaul something different than what we currently have with this private public kind of overlap, that's going to be really hard, right? And kind of what I talked about here in the beginning, I believe we need a second New Deal, but we also have to make sure, just like in the New Deal, that we start passing things that actually can get through immediately and people can start seeing. So not to dodge the question, but like the FICA tax is dollars right back into people's pockets immediately, right? It's a way that we can actually start helping alleviate the problem. Then we can move to the next stage. And then eventually, if we win enough elections, we can deal with healthcare. But that's going to be a very long fight. Let's not forget when we passed the ACA, we had 60 Democrats and we barely got it through in the Senate. Like a lot of that's going to depend. Is the Senate going to get rid of the filibuster? What are they going to do? Because in the House, you only need a majority of one. In the Senate, it gets a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and the idea makes sense to me that we have to, pun intended, put Band-Aids on Medicare, Medicaid, rural health, and the ACA subsidies. But to me, that just is a patchwork solution that addresses, I mean, what we have in this country, from my perspective, is not healthcare. We have a healthcare insurance business. So the question is, how can we actually improve the standard of healthcare across the board?
I mean, unfortunately, the short answer is unless there's 60 votes in the Senate, overhaul. It kind of gets back to the piece about the Senate we talked about earlier, right? Unless we can, we can expand the House of Representatives, changing power in the Senate gets a lot harder because it's a constitutional amendment. Like the Senate's going to have to step up and come with a plan. That isn't to dodge it, but it's just saying like if they're going to require 60 votes, what is a proposal we could actually get through on healthcare? I don't know what that looks like. Neither party's really put one forward.
Would you support West Coast states teaming up with British Columbia and basically unifying around a Canadian national health system for the 50 million people that live out here?
I mean, look, I'm open to a lot of ideas. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to see how legally that would work, right? I mean, I think this idea, though, of if states want to try to figure out, California's 40-ish million people, right? Washington, Oregon, we're getting, to your point, getting close to, I don't know how many people live in British Columbia, but let's say close to 50. I mean, that's like the size of, almost the United Kingdom. If we can build a healthcare system that works, I'm all for it, right? But what I want to make sure is that what I'm running is I want to make sure people go see a doctor, right? And unfortunately, we have to live inside the system that we have. And also, getting back to a 21st century economy, one of the hurdles for entrepreneurs is if you leave your company to go start a business, you don't really have healthcare. And all of a sudden you get sick, and not only does your business fail, but you're in economic ruin, right? And so that's something that no one should have to face. We do need to solve this. The question just becomes, what is actually something we can get through? And unfortunately, I wish we could just wave a wand and say, we're going to totally get to a universal single payer healthcare system. I don't know how we get there from where we're at. What I do know is we can expand the ACA subsidies. We can actually make sure people see a doctor. We can start solving people's problems and hopefully getting better outcomes. But we are in a mess that is just because of the fact that for too long, both parties have to your point, been putting Band-Aids on bullet holes. And until we get major reform, and I hope it will come soon, but with the power structures we have, it gets really hard. One of the reasons I talk about the FICA tax, going back to taxes, is that can all be done through reconciliation. Right. A lot of that stuff doesn't require the 60 vote threshold in the Senate, which is really, I get the Senate's designed to be deliberative and slow things down. But I mean, come on, at some point, we got to actually start evolving into a 21st century country.
One of the things that Greg and I talk a lot on this podcast about is sort of a failure of imagination and a failure to think big. I want to unspool the thread around employer-based health insurance. Is there a reason why Medicare could not be a fallback for people who lose their health insurance because of unemployment or you're between jobs? Just for the sake of argument, if you lose your job, you can go on Medicare for a year or 6
instead
months,
of COBRA, right? Which is very expensive, right? And so I think that's a great idea. I mean, I think sometimes we get trapped in like single payer or universal healthcare, but certainly we need the government to act as a secondary payer in a lot of cases to bring the cost down, right? And that's a piece of the healthcare puzzle that I think we've lost the narrative on. And I think, Ashley, you bring up a really good point. Like we already have systems in place. We're just not plugging them in everywhere. So I would certainly be supportive of, if you're on unemployment, if you're starting a business. I mean, people are saying, well, maybe we should do tax-free for the first 2 years of businesses. Maybe it's a deal where Medicare, if you start a business the first 2 years, you're on Medicare, right? Or your ability to cover that. I mean, there's a lot of ways we can get creative in the systems we have that could start solving problems now. So I would be fully supportive.
Yeah, it was interesting. I spoke earlier in the podcast to an Italian farmer named Ariane Lotte. She actually grew up in New York. And she talked about one thing she never has to worry about running a small business in Italy is healthcare. I don't think that argument gets made enough that maybe the best case for single payer is that it actually is an incentive for small businesses to just focus on their small business.
Well, I mean, it's one of the biggest drivers, of cost for businesses, period, is it's also hard to give wage increases when the cost of healthcare continues to go up, right? I mean, at the end of the day, a business, a nonprofit, any organization has money coming in the door and money going out the door, right? And if the money going out the door is being eaten by an increase in healthcare costs, it means it's not going to wages, right? It's not going to deal in reinvestment. It's not going to new technologies, right? So it's a really big problem. And the question just is, in the power structures we're in, how do we get to a solution that allows people to go see a doctor, which is my biggest concern, right? Because right now, just when I campaigned for Obama in 2007 and 2008, our goal was to make healthcare so affordable that everyone would be able to get it. Well, that dream has not come to fruition, right? And that's what I believe in. And there's a lot of ways to get there. And we got to start putting things on the floor to actually make sure that can happen.
I started a business during the pandemic in 2021, and I was only able to do that because my partner had health insurance that I could then go on.
Right.
And so it makes me wonder how many companies are not getting formed every year. What is the next unicorn that isn't getting founded because the founding team has young kids, or they have a partner who has an illness that costs a lot of money and they really need that predictability of health insurance.
Yeah, I mean, and it doesn't even have to be a unicorn. I mean, think about just opening like a restaurant or a pizza shop, right? Like, you're worried about getting customers. You're worried about how are you going to pay for that first round of inventory, right? And you end up getting sick, or one of your employees gets sick, and all of a sudden you got to go find another employee. I mean, this is a reality for even small business across the country. Like, this is a real problem. Or let's say, we have a lot of baby boomers who own corporations and businesses right now, big and small, that are looking to retire. But no one can take that leap to take on that business because they don't know whether their family of 3 or 4 is going to be able to afford the health insurance. I mean, that's not a scenario. That's not a healthy economy. That's not what we should be in.
Brandon, this is a show about what ifs on the West Coast. So we're going to hit you with a bunch of questions. Let's hear your rapid response answers. What if you're elected as part of a blue wave?
Well, I mean, I hope it's a blue wave. So the what if is, what's the if? I mean, let's hope it is a blue wave.
Then what happens? What is on the Congress's agenda?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the blue wave, let's hopefully carry into the Senate, right? I mean, that's really the key. We get the House, and I think we get the House with a pretty decent margin, but the Senate becomes the what if. I hope we start dealing with the economic crisis in this country. We call it affordability, but let's call it what it is. It's an economic crisis that too many people aren't able to make ends meet. And we gave the reasons earlier in the podcast. I hope that the Democratic Party stays laser focused on the economy and says we're going to do everything we can to start making lives better for people so that we can win the 28, 2030, 2032, and 2034 elections, and we can start solving some of these bigger problems, because we need longer than 2 years or 4 years to do that.
It will be really tempting, if you're elected, for Congress to tackle the Trump administration. What if you had to choose between prosecuting impeachment and pursuing an affordability agenda? What would you do?
I would go for affordability. It's not, this administration needs to be held accountable. That's not saying I think Donald Trump shouldn't, face and we shouldn't go through investigations and potentially consider impeachment across cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, fill in the blank. But ultimately, I'm being sent to Washington because people are really struggling in this country. And what we've seen is people vote Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and then they just voted for Mamdani in New York because the economy's not working. And until a party figures out the economy, we're just going to keep ping-ponging.
What if you're elected and are wildly successful? What does that look like?
I think wildly successful would be we start putting cash back in the hands. Start putting cash back in the hands of workers. I would be so proud if I can get FICA done. If I can get what we talked about, which is $3,000 back in the hands of every worker in this country, and I can make sure that wealthy Americans continue to pay all the way up and I make Social Security solvent, that would be a success.
What if you were elected in a blue wave?
Yeah.
Is bipartisanship worth pursuing?
I think look, there's places like we talked about the catastrophic homeowners insurance. Like that's not a red or blue issue, but someone's got to reach back across the aisle. Like this isn't just we keep putting our hand out and it keeps getting chopped off. Like at some point, someone's got to reach back. And if someone's there willing to reach out, I'm there, right? Like, and that's what I promised to do.
If you believe politics should be judged by whether people can afford to live their lives, this conversation matters. Brandon Riker's argument is simple, but disruptive. Fix the economy first, or nothing else holds. For Ashley Brown, this is Greg Amrofell. Thanks for being with us in Pacific Time. And if you want more conversations like this, subscribe to Pacific Time, share this episode, and join the community on Substack. We'll see you next time.